Now that you've incorporated the UFO into the scene, you're ready to create the fake handheld camera effect and apply some final color correction passes. You can also open the Part 4 project file and just start from there. Even though all of our work so far has taken place inside a great big 4K comp, our plan all along has been to crop into that larger comp to simulate a lower res handheld camera moving around to follow the action we've choreographed. To do that, we'll take advantage of one of After Effects' most powerful features, called nested compositions. Create a new comp by clicking on the comp button. Call it Camera Move or Render Me or whatever. Ignore the presets and type in 1280 by 720 and 24 frames per second. Now, depending on your settings, you may have to switch off the aspect ratio lock to dial in these settings exactly. And lastly, make sure it's 15 seconds long and click OK. We now have an empty comp, so let's drag our background into it, which we can do in the list view here in the project panel. Boom! We now have a 720p window looking into our 4K comp. Now you just need to animate your background to simulate a camera looking around. You may be tempted to use position keyframes for this, and if you were just panning around, that would work out fine. But we also want to zoom in and out a little. And this is getting a little bit advanced, but I ask you to trust me on this. If you're going to both move and zoom into a larger layer in a smaller comp, the best way to do that is to animate the anchor point of a layer, not the position. The anchor point is, by default, the center of the layer. And because we added the background to the comp by dragging items in the project panel, the anchor point should now be centered conveniently in the comp window here. If you twirl open the transform properties for the layer, you can see that the position values are exactly centered on the dimensions of the comp, while the anchor point is centered on the dimensions of the much larger layer. Zoom way out, and hopefully this will make sense. If you now scrub the anchor point values in the timeline, especially while we're zoomed out, you'll see that you can change the view of the pixels appearing on screen even though the position of the layer hasn't technically changed, because you're changing the attach point for the layer. Adjust these values until you can see the full moon centered on the screen. And this is why we use anchor point. I now want to zoom in on the moon using scale. If we had changed the position of the layer instead of the anchor, zooming would be tricky because zoom is centered on the anchor point. Since we kept the anchor point centered in our comp, we can freely zoom in and the screen will magnify around the center of our view, just like a real camera. Okay, so now you can get a little freeform. I'll do some steps here and you should generally follow along, but don't worry if you aren't entering exactly the same values at exactly the same times. I'll frame the scene on the full moon to start, move to about 2 seconds, and enable animation for scale and for anchor. I'll drag ahead about a second, and I'll set my scale value back to 100, and adjust the framing so it includes both the moon and the Chrysler Building. Scrub to almost 5 seconds, and set keyframes with the same values. Do this by clicking on the keyframe icon, not on the stopwatch, which will turn off animation altogether. Don't want that. These 2 sets of keyframes freeze the action for these few seconds. Now move ahead a half second or so and adjust the anchor point so the camera is now pointed almost but not quite all the way up left, where the UFO is coming into view. This next bit is not supposed to be a smooth track. It's supposed to feel handheld. So drag ahead a couple seconds and adjust the anchor. Drag again and adjust, and so on to the end of the comp. You can totally improvise this. And at the end, I'll animate another zoom effect, accidentally zooming out before zooming in to follow the ship more closely. Okay, for a rough move, this looks pretty good. but an automated wiggle will help it look even better. In the Effects and Presets panel, search for wiggle-position. There it is, and drag it onto our background. Now, as you can see in the effect controls, the scene is wiggling the position by default up to 50 pixels in any direction once per second. 50 is good when the camera is following the UFO, but it's probably too much for the start of the scene. So working backwards, we'll animate that value down to 10 during the first wild move.